My name is Walt Delaney, and before I tell you what happened last spring, you need to understand something about my land. The Delaney Ranch has been in my family for 83 years. My grandfather bought 200 acres of scrubland back when nobody wanted it, and 3 generations of us turned it into something worth having. Cattle, hay fields, a small herd of horses my wife breeds and trains. It's not a hobby. It's a working ranch, and every single day depends on being able to get equipment in and out of that front gate. That gate sits at the end of Larkspur Lane, a gravel road that predates the housing development next door by about 60 years. When Meadow Ridge Estates went up 8 years ago, the county granted my family a permanent recorded easement across the last 100 feet of that road, because the developer needed our cooperation to finish the waterline extension. It's on record at the courthouse. It's on the deed. It is, as my lawyer would later put it, about as ironclad as an easement gets. None of that mattered to Deborah Voss. Deborah moved into Meadow Ridge about 2 years ago, and within 6 months she was president of the HOA. I want to be fair here. Not everyone on that board was unreasonable. Most of my neighbors over there were decent people who waved when I drove by and never said a word about the smell of cattle on a warm day, which, if you've never lived near a ranch, is just part of the deal. But Deborah decided almost immediately that Larkspur Lane belonged to the neighborhood, easement or not, and that my farm equipment had no business using her road. It started small. A nasty note zip tied to my mailbox about gravel dust. A complaint to the county about noise from the hay baler, which got dismissed in about 4 minutes because agricultural operations are exempt from the noise ordinance. Little things. Annoying, but the kind of thing you brush off because you've got cattle to feed and a life to run. Then, in March, she parked her Jeep across my gate for the first time. I remember it clearly because I had a delivery of feed corn coming that morning, and I needed to move my tractor down to meet the truck at the far pasture. I came around the bend in my truck and there it was, a red Jeep Wrangler, parked sideways, blocking the entire width of the gravel road right where it narrows before my gate. Not on the shoulder. Not pulled off to the side. Sideways, deliberately, like she'd measured it. I got out, walked up, and there was a laminated sign zip tied to her windshield wiper. Private community road, no commercial vehicles. I called the number on the HOA newsletter. Deborah picked up on the second ring, like she'd been waiting. Mrs. Voss, your Jeep is blocking my ranch entrance. That's a community road, Mr. Delaney. Your farm equipment is tearing up the surface and it's a liability concern for the residents. I've asked you before. I have a recorded easement. I can email you the document right now. I'll have our attorney look at it, she said, which I would learn over the following weeks was code for absolutely nothing happening. I ended up calling a tow company myself that day, at my own expense, because I had a truck full of feed corn idling on the road and cattle that don't care about property disputes. The tow driver, a guy named Ruben who I'd end up talking to more than once over the coming months, told me this wasn't his first call to that address. I filed a police report. The deputy who came out was polite but explained that since the Jeep was on a private road within HOA jurisdiction, and since I couldn't prove immediate financial loss beyond the towing fee, it would likely be treated as a civil parking dispute rather than criminal obstruction, unless it became a pattern. It became a pattern. Over the following 6 weeks, Deborah parked that Jeep across my gate 4 more times. Each time, I documented it. Photos with timestamps, video on my phone, copies of the easement paperwork mailed to the HOA board, certified. Each time, I had to either wait, tow it, or in one case, walk half a mile around through a neighbor's field with a hand truck to get medical supplies to a horse with colic because the vet's van couldn't get through. That last one is the one that really got under my skin. My mare, Copper, was in real distress that night, and my vet, Dr. Alvarez, had to park on the far side of the Jeep and hike in with her bag while I held a flashlight. Copper pulled through fine, thank God, but I remember standing in that pasture at 11 at night thinking about how close it had come to being a very different story, all because a woman 2 streets over had decided my recorded easement was a suggestion. I hired a lawyer after that. Her name was Priscilla Wynne, and she was about 5'2" and utterly relentless. She sent Deborah and the HOA board a formal cease and desist, attached the recorded easement, attached the county's original approval documents from the waterline extension, and laid out, in very plain language, that continued obstruction could result in a civil suit for damages, including the vet emergency, plus potential personal liability for Deborah individually, separate from the HOA. For about 3 weeks, it worked. The Jeep stayed away. I actually thought it was over. Then came the day of the cattle drive. Twice a year, I move my herd from the north pasture to the lower grazing land near the creek, and it requires the tractor pulling a trailer, plus my hired hand Thomas on his ATV, plus me on horseback keeping the herd bunched. It's a slow, careful operation. Cattle spook easily, and the timing matters because I coordinate with a neighboring rancher, Hal Prentice, who brings his flatbed to help haul supplies partway. That morning, everyone was in position. Hal was already waiting on the county road. Thomas had the ATV warmed up. I was on my horse, Duke, at the top of the pasture, and the herd was already moving toward the gate in that slow-rolling way cattle do when they sense something's happening. And there was the Jeep. Sideways again. Same spot. I want to be clear about something, because this is the part of the story people always ask about later. I did not, at any point, intend to hit that vehicle. I want to say that plainly because I know how these stories can get exaggerated in the retelling, and what actually happened was dramatic enough without anybody needing to invent something worse. Here's what happened. I radioed Thomas to hold the herd at the top of the rise while I dealt with the gate. I called Deborah's cell, no answer. I called the tow company, Reuben again, and he told me his truck was 35 minutes out on another call. 35 minutes might not sound like much, but with 60 head of cattle bunched and getting restless behind a hold line, 35 minutes is an eternity. Cattle held in place too long start pushing against each other, start looking for a way around, and the whole operation gets more dangerous by the minute, not less. I made a decision. I got on my tractor, which was already hitched to the stock trailer, engine running, positioned right behind the gate on my side, and I started forward, slow, at what my old odometer would call about 1 mile an hour. Slower than a walking pace. I was not trying to reach that Jeep quickly. I was trying to make it absolutely clear, visibly and unmistakably, that the tractor was not going to stop, and that the Jeep needed to move, because I had 60 cattle and 3 people depending on that gate opening in the next few minutes. I'll admit, there's a version of this where I sound like the villain. A 12,000-pound tractor with a loaded trailer rolling steadily toward a parked car sounds alarming no matter how slow it's going. But you have to understand, that Jeep was on my legal easement. I had already called for a tow. I had already tried to reach her by phone. I had documentation going back 6 weeks. And the tractor genuinely was not going to stop, because behind me was a herd of cattle that could not be held indefinitely, and the safest thing for everyone, the cattle, my crew, and yes, even Deborah's Jeep, was for that vehicle to no longer be in the road. It turned out Deborah was home. She came running out of her house in her bathrobe, phone already up recording, screaming that I was trying to kill her and destroy her property. I want to note, calmly, that at no point was she in any danger, because she wasn't in the vehicle, and the tractor was moving at a pace slower than most people walk their dogs. But the Jeep was. She got to the Jeep with about 15 feet of space between the front bumper of my tractor and her back bumper. She jumped in, started it, and peeled it off the road so fast she clipped her own mailbox post on the way past. The tractor rolled through the gate a moment later, right on schedule, and I moved my herd down to the creek without another word exchanged. Thomas said afterward that watching Deborah sprint across her lawn in a bathrobe was the funniest thing he'd seen all year, and I won't pretend I didn't find it satisfying, though I'll admit I was more relieved than amused in the moment. My whole focus had been on the cattle. But that 15 feet of space became a 200-foot legal battle. Deborah filed a police report that afternoon claiming I had attempted to run her over with agricultural machinery. The deputy who responded, thankfully, was the same one from my earlier report, and he reviewed my dashcam footage, which I'd had mounted on the tractor for weeks specifically because I anticipated something like this happening. The footage showed exactly what I've described, a slow, steady approach, clear visibility of the Jeep the entire time, no sudden acceleration, and Deborah's own voice on a neighbor's doorbell camera, recorded 2 streets over, admitting to a friend the week before that she parks there specifically to make a point. That doorbell footage, it turned out, was the thing that changed everything. A neighbor named Connie Alfaro, who lived across from Deborah and had grown tired of the whole saga, had heard about the incident and remembered her doorbell camera picked up conversations on the sidewalk sometimes. She went back through her footage voluntarily and found Deborah, a week before the cattle drive, telling another resident, "I know it's technically their easement, but if I park there enough times, eventually they'll just stop using that entrance altogether. It's a war of attrition." Connie sent that clip to my lawyer without me even asking. Once that recording existed, the county attorney's office declined to pursue any charges against me at all, and instead opened an inquiry into whether Deborah's conduct constituted intentional obstruction of a recorded easement, which, as it turns out, carries both civil and potentially criminal weight in our state when done repeatedly and with demonstrated intent. The HOA board, faced with the doorbell footage, the 6 weeks of documented incidents, the vet emergency with copper, and now a formal inquiry from the county attorney, did what HOA boards do when the liability math stops working out in their favor. They held an emergency session. I wasn't there, but Hal's daughter-in-law lives in Meadow Ridge and gave me the play-by-play afterward. Apparently, it got heated. One board member reportedly said, "You told us this was settled after their lawyer sent the letter," and Deborah's response was something like, "I was handling it." She was removed as HOA president within the week, by a 5-1 vote. She stayed on the board briefly as a regular member, then resigned entirely about a month later, citing what her resignation letter called personal reasons, though most of the neighborhood understood exactly what that meant. My lawyer, Priscilla, still pursued the civil case, because the vet emergency with copper had created real, documented costs, and because 6 weeks of repeated obstruction on a recorded easement isn't something you just let go once the person who did it feels embarrassed. We settled out of court about 2 months later. Deborah's insurance covered the settlement, which included reimbursement for towing fees, the emergency vet visit costs from that colic night, and a formal, recorded acknowledgement that the Delaney Ranch easement on Larkspur Lane could never be obstructed by any resident or vehicle again, with an automatic daily fine built into the agreement for any future violation. My lawyer made sure that clause was airtight, because by that point we'd all learned the hard way that a polite letter wasn't going to be enough. I saw Deborah exactly once more after the settlement. It was at the feed store, of all places, about 4 months later. She was in line ahead of me buying birdseed, and when she turned around and saw me, I half expected another confrontation. Instead, she just sort of nodded, tight-lipped, and said, "Delaney." I nodded back and said, "Voss," and that was the whole exchange. I didn't need an apology. I just needed my gate to stay clear, and it has, every single day since. The strange part of this whole saga is what it did for the rest of the neighborhood. A handful of Meadow Ridge residents reached out to me afterward, some I'd never spoken to before, just to say they were glad it got resolved, and a couple even mentioned that Deborah had tried to rally support against me early on and most people had quietly declined to get involved, feeling like it wasn't really their fight. Connie Alfaro, the neighbor with the doorbell camera, ended up becoming a genuine friend. She brings her grandkids by every spring to see the new calves, and I've told her more than once that if she ever needs eggs or firewood, she just has to ask. Hal Prentice still gives me grief about the whole thing, calls it the day Walt Delaney invented a new sport, competitive tractor parking. Thomas, for his part, made a habit for weeks afterward of yelling "Clear the road," in a mock serious announcer voice any time we approached the gate, just to make everybody laugh. Even my wife, who I'll admit was more worried than amused during the actual event, eventually softened enough to joke that Deborah's mailbox post probably has more respect for our easement now than Deborah ever did. Copper, my mare, made a full recovery from that colic scare and is doing just fine, out grazing with the rest of the herd as I write this. Every time I walk past that gate, I think about how close that whole situation could have gone sideways in a much worse way, and how grateful I am that it didn't. I think about how easy it would have been for me to lose my temper months earlier, to say something I regretted, to escalate things in a way that made me the problem instead of the solution. Instead, I documented everything, I stayed calm, I called for backup instead of confrontation, and when the moment finally came where I had no other option but to move that tractor forward, I made absolutely sure I did it safely, slowly, and with full visibility, because the last thing I wanted was for anyone, including Deborah, to actually get hurt. I just needed my gate clear, and the truth, backed up by law and by a neighbor's doorbell camera, did the rest. People ask me sometimes if I regret how it played out, whether I wish I'd handled the whole thing differently from the start. Honestly, no. I think about what would have happened if I'd let that first parked Jeep slide, and the second, and the third, just to keep the peace. I think Deborah would have kept pushing, kept testing, kept believing that a piece of paper at the courthouse meant less than her own sense of ownership over a road that was never hers to control. Sometimes the only way people learn where the line actually is when they finally run into it, clearly and undeniably, with proof nobody can argue against. These days, Larkspur Lane is quiet again, the way it was before Meadow Ridge went in. My tractor rolls through that gate every morning without incident, the cattle move to pasture on schedule, and the only sign anything ever happened is a small dent in a mailbox post 2 streets over, which, as far as I know, nobody's ever bothered to fix. I like to think of it as a little monument to the day somebody finally learned that some roads, and some rights, just aren't up for negotiation, no matter how many times you park across them. And if you're out there dealing with your own version of a Deborah, a neighbor, an HOA, anybody who thinks persistence can outlast the law, my advice is simple. Document everything. Stay calm. Get a lawyer before you get angry. And whatever you do, don't stop showing up, because eventually, one way or another, the truth has a way of clearing its own path.